The city of Lviv was established sometime in the 13th century. When exactly is still up for debate, but generally the Prince of Galicia, Prince Danilo Romanovich, is credited with its founding. In traditional historiography, Danilo founded Lviv in 1256 after the Mongol invasion into the territories of the Kievan Rus had caused a wave of refugees into Galicia. Danilo named the city after his own son Lev, whose name translates to lion in English. As such, the lion remains the city's poster animal to this day. In 1270, Lviv became the capital of the Galician-Volhynian Principality, and due to its advantageous position in the middle of Europe, it quickly became an important centre of trade. After the last Galician prince died without an heir, the Polish king Casimir III laid siege to the city and captured it in 1340. Later, it was annexed into the Polish kingdom, and it also received its Polish name, Lwów. In the late 14th century, Lwów's status as a trade city was cemented after King Louis I granted the city exclusive trading rights. Every merchant that passed through had to stop there for 2 weeks and offer their goods for sale. This gave Lwów a de facto monopoly on all trade that flowed from the Orient into the Polish kingdom. As the city's wealth grew, so did its population, from about 5,000 at the beginning of the 15th century to roughly 30,000 in 1620. What made Lwów so special in the Polish kingdom was its multi-ethnic population. Alongside Poles and Ukrainians, the city was also inhabited by a significant number of Germans, Jews and Armenians, alongside small groups of Italians, Spaniards, Greeks, Turks and many more. Until around 1550, German was the most spoken language in both administration and commerce, but as time went on, the German minority slowly assimilated into Polish culture, and the Polish language became predominant. The other ethnic groups also saw a process of assimilation into Polish culture, albeit at a much smaller pace. Only the Jews, who were separated from the other ethnic groups but still enjoyed special privileges and stood under the direct jurisdiction of the royal governor, managed to resist this progress for the most part. All good things come to an end, however, and by the 18th century, Lwów's golden era had long passed. The general reorientation of European commerce away from continental to overseas trade deprived the city of much-needed income. In 1704, Swedish troops marched into the city and sacked it. For the very first time since the medieval era, this seemingly impenetrable fortress was occupied. In the subsequent decades, severe mismanagement from the nobility caused the city to decline even further. When Austrian troops took over the city in 1772, after the first partition of Poland, Lwów was just a miserable shell of its former glory. Some of the suburban areas were destroyed, and a lot of the buildings in the city centre were simply abandoned. The once proud Gothic town hall was in urgent need of renovation, and partially served as a prison. The trenches within the city walls were used as a rubbish dump, and properly paved roads were nowhere to be found. The Austrian Emperor, Joseph II himself, who visited the city in 1773, got stuck in the morass which formed after long rains. Economically, the city wasn't doing well either. The Poles, Jews and Armenians made a rather subpar living by producing and selling local goods, while the Ukrainians mostly worked as servants and small-time labourers. Very quickly, the new rulers began to incorporate the city into the realm of the Habsburg monarchy. The city got a new name, Lemberg, and was made the capital of the new Austrian crownland of Galicia and Lodomeria. Joseph II swiftly implemented a series of enlightened reforms to fully integrate Lemberg and established an exemplary state administration in Galicia. The first big change that Austrian rule brought with it was the curtailment of the political rights of the nobility and the clergy. Under the Kingdom of Poland, the nobility, known as the Szlachta, wielded considerable authority, governing autonomously within voivodeships and regional councils, while the monarch's influence was minimal. From now on, only the authority of the governor and the central government in Vienna mattered. All the state goods the nobility had administered were confiscated, and the right to legal jurisdiction over their subjects was revoked. Furthermore, Joseph II also abolished servitude and significantly reduced the number of compulsory labour required by farmers. To appease the outraged nobles, Joseph II granted them honorary titles and limited roles in government. After the nobles had lost the right to govern, a new bureaucratic apparatus had to be erected, and thus thousands of civil servants arrived from the country's German-speaking areas in the hopes of a successful career. quickly they began to work as bureaucrats, commissioners, secretaries, registrars, and whatnot. Their arrogant demeanour and their ineptitude quickly made them notorious among the citizens of Lemberg. As Franz Kratter, a contemporary who published his experiences in a series of letters in 1786, put it, "I got to know very hard-working, skillful, upright civil servants in Lemberg, but of course only a few, only the 10th of whom one can say he is useful to the state. He provides it with worthy services. The reverse ratio would of course be better and more beneficial, but if that is not the case, who will do it differently?" All of the newly established provincial authorities had to be housed somewhere, and so Joseph II issued that a number of Lemberg's countless churches and abbeys be transformed into public offices. It only took a couple of years for the new Austrian rulers to completely displace the traditional ruling class and to consolidate their presence. The beautiful Baroque Lubomirski Palace, situated right on the market square, was transformed into the residence of the governor of Galicia. Other palaces were turned into barracks. The traders with their stands and stalls who frequented the market square and sold their goods were chased away because they disrupted the ideal of an orderly city. The old Trinitarian monastery complex alongside the city fortifications was turned into a university. Additionally, an effort was made to Germanize Lemberg, despite the fact that the majority of its inhabitants were native Polish speakers. In 1785, German was introduced as an official language. Soon after, the local schools began to teach in German, and in 1824 even the university switched from using Latin to using German. The very first newspaper in Lemberg, the Gazette de Leopold, printed its articles in French, but was soon replaced by the German Lemberger Zeitung. Until the 1830s, even the grave inscriptions were mostly carved in German. In the first quarter of the 19th century, Lemberg grew continuously as thousands of people flocked in search of employment and a better life. In 1772, when the Austrians took over the city, Lemberg had a population of just about 20,000. By 1820, that number had grown to almost 70,000. Under Austrian rule, the architecture and city design of Lemberg changed drastically. Faced with the ruinous condition of much of the urban fabric, great attention was put into expanding and ameliorating the city. A general Verschönerungsplan, or beautification plan, had already been developed in the 1780s by the Crownland building director, who answered directly to the court in Vienna. By 1820, the old fortification system surrounding the city had been completely demolished. In its place, large green public promenades were established. West of the city centre, a large promenade surrounded by imposing Biedermeier-style houses began to serve as a popular alternative to the market square and was often frequented by people who wanted to take a walk or wanted to catch up on the latest news. Today, this square is known as Prospekt Svobody, but in the late 19th century it was known as Karl-Ludwig-Straße. At the top of the square, a new theatre, designed by the Viennese architect Ludwig Pichel, was built, called the Skarbeck Theatre. In general, the newly built architecture tried to imitate the style of the buildings along the Herrengasse in Vienna. In the eastern section of the former ramparts, a new and sizable governor's palace was constructed, alongside a new residence for the Catholic archbishops. One of the most notable buildings from that time period is the new town hall. As I've mentioned already, the town hall was in a terrible state when the Austrians arrived, so terrible in fact that parts of it needed to be torn down. The city planners figured that renovating the old town hall was too costly and, quite frankly, pointless, and so they worked on a new design. Initially, the tower was supposed to be preserved and integrated into the new structure, but that plan became irrelevant after the tower rudely collapsed in 1826. And so the leading architects, Josef Makel and Franz Drescher, had to design a completely new building. The town hall was finally finished in 1835, and what a sight it was. It was a huge structure, about twice as big as its predecessor, and it was built in the neoclassical style. The main hall was richly decorated with marble and gilded stucco. At the very top of the tower, a lion and the Habsburg eagle served as proud symbols for the power of the Austrian monarchy. The citizens were happy with the new building. One text even called it a precious stone in a beautiful ring. Alongside giving the town council a place to reside in, the new town hall also had a different purpose: to show the recent successes at urbanizing and at beautifying Lemberg. But why did the Austrian authorities put so much effort into redesigning Lemberg? The first and most obvious reason is that the new layout made the city much easier to clean and to navigate. Secondly, the wide and bright streets made it much easier to take control in case of an armed uprising, and made it much harder for protesters to build barricades. Thirdly, the bureaucrats in Lemberg wanted to turn the city into a kind of Vienna of the East. Many of them were convinced of the cultural and political superiority of the Habsburg monarchy over the old Polish aristocratic republic. The fancy new German-style buildings were supposed to be a stark contrast to the Baroque Polish architecture, which was seen as backwards and inferior. And this endeavour was rather successful. Many contemporary travellers noted that the new neoclassical urban environment, the new parks and cafes, the new theatre and university, as well as the modern streets gave Lemberg a remarkably German character, at least in its centre. As you might imagine, the Polish majority in the city wasn't too pleased about the fact that Lemberg was on its way to becoming a German-dominated city once again. For decades after the Austrian takeover, Polish cultural life was mostly restricted to theatres, community saloons and casinos. The old Polish elite exercised virtually no political power. Only in the regional parliament, which met once per year, could the representatives of the nobility and the clergy attempt to influence political decision-making, at least in theory. Because, as the Lemberg police director, Leopold Johann Nepomuk von Sacher-Masoch, put it, here the Polish nobility solemnly present their subversive ideas, which were solemnly heard by the representatives of the government and then solemnly dismissed. But still, it can generally be observed that resistance against Austrian rule was only a rare occurrence, even among the Polish nobility, who had been deprived of their privileged position under Joseph II. One example of resistance was a 49-page document authored by the leaders of the Galician nobility and presented to Emperor Leopold II in 1790. The authors complained that the Austrian government wouldn't accommodate them on important issues and defended the practice of serfdom, claiming that it had worked well during the times of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and that the serfs were treated well. Life in the Commonwealth was romanticized, while the social reforms introduced in Galicia in the 18th century were decried as unnecessary and as a threat to social order. For example, a reform which allowed children to bring their parents to court was blamed for leading to familial discord and even to broken marriages. The same document also claimed that the new German language policy amounted to ordering the Polish nation to forget their mother tongue in a few years, which is nonsensical given the fact that the use of the Polish language outside of administration and education was never forbidden. But interestingly enough, despite of all these complaints and grievances, the nobles still recognized the legitimacy of Habsburg rule, and it's clear that most of them had made their peace with the Austrian takeover out of a lack of any viable alternative. This widespread acceptance from the Polish elite was mostly due to the fact that Austrian rule was seen as the lesser evil compared to either Prussian or Russian domination. For example, when Polish Napoleonic troops from the Duchy of Warsaw entered Lemberg in 1809, the euphoria among the Poles who still harbored hopes for a revival of the old Commonwealth and a return of their privileges was quickly squashed by the subsequent Russian occupation. An inquiry made by the administration of Galicia in 1812, which was tasked with evaluating the predominant mood of the population of Lemberg during the occupation, came to the following conclusion. I have to ensure your excellency that the local citizens in general behaved in a troublesome rather than supportive manner during the aforementioned epoch. Yet, as concerns the novelties that the foreign authorities introduced, their very short presence caused mistrust in them, that is by the local population, and the wish for the Austrian government's return became predominant among the local population. Furthermore, the Austrians tried to charm the Polish elite by following a more pro-Polish course. The most obvious example of this was the opening of the Ossolineum, a national institute and library. The idea for it was conceived by Count Józef Maximilian Ossolinski, a scholar who had moved from Warsaw to Vienna after the partitions of Poland. There, Ossolinski began to collect books, prints, maps, manuscripts and lithographs, and he even wrote a number of studies on the history of Poland and Polish literature himself. Using his wealth, he also financed the creation of the first Polish dictionary and the opening of the Department of Polish Language and Literature at the University of Lemberg. He did all this in the spirit of the late Enlightenment and hoped to make a donation to the nation and the sciences, as he put it himself. He wasn't a rebel by any means, but a patriot who hoped to promote Polish culture by collecting its literary works and wanted to educate the public. His ultimate goal was to replace the prestigious Załuski Library in Warsaw, the first public library in Poland. It had been dissolved by the Russian authorities after the failed Kościuszko uprising, and its entire inventory had been transported to St. Petersburg. Ossolinski wouldn't live long enough to make his dream come true, and it was only after his death when his collection got relocated to Lemberg. With financial support from the governor of Galicia, August Lobkowicz, the Ossolineum was housed in a former Carmelite cloister at the very edge of Lemberg, and in 1832 it was opened to the public. To show the gratefulness and loyalty to the Austrian Empire, the Ossolineum hung up a portrait of the most serene protector, Emperor Franz I. Simultaneously, the Austrian government also tried to curry favor with Lemberg's other Slavic ethnicity, the Ukrainians or Ruthenians. They granted the Uniate or Greek Catholic Church, which most Ukrainians were a part of, equal status with the Roman Catholic Church. After the Napoleonic Wars, a small circle of intellectuals emerged among the clergy of the Greek Catholic Church, such as the historian Michailo Harasevich or the grammarian Ivan Mohylnitsky. However, these early scholars still wrote their works in either Latin, German, or Polish. That all drastically changed in 1832, when a new patriotic circle formed among the students of Lemberg's Greek Catholic Theological Seminary. This so-called Ruthenian triad was headed by the poet and writer Jakub Holowacki, and it attempted to spread the idea that the Ruthenians living in Galicia were all part of one Ukrainian people with a common history and culture. In 1837, the triad published a small book titled Die Nymph of the Dniester, which was promptly banned by the Austrian authorities. The content of the book was not worth mentioning, but what made it so outrageous was that it was written in spoken Ukrainian, and thus kick-started a movement in favor of using vernacular Ukrainian for Ukrainian literature published in Austria. As the police director of Lemberg put it, "We already have enough trouble with one nationality, meaning the Poles, and these madmen want to resurrect the dead and buried Ruthenian nationality." But not every educated Ukrainian was in favor of this new development. The Greek Catholic Metropolitan of Lemberg, Michailo Lewicki, complained that the use of peasant language, as he called it, was undignified and indecent. While the triad would eventually fall apart, its work also led many Ukrainians to question their relationship with the Poles. For a long time, the Ukrainian elite had gotten most of their ideas from Polish colleagues and had been heavily influenced by them. Now, with the assertion that Ukrainians were a completely different nationality, a nationalist movement began to emerge that questioned Polish predominance over Lemberg and Galicia as a whole. And finally, it's time to take a look at the last major group in Lemberg, the Jews. Until the 1860s, Lemberg was the city with the highest Jewish population in the entire Habsburg Empire, and while they enjoyed religious freedom, they were ruthlessly exploited for financial gains by the Austrian authorities. They had to pay special taxes, such as the kosher tax or a candle tax for the use of their ritual candles. They also had to pay special fees in order to build synagogues or to marry. Additionally, they were only allowed to reside within a designated area, which consisted of 2 suburbs and 3 streets. As you can imagine, the living conditions in this ghetto were abysmal, and the residents lived crammed together in tiny flats, and despite numerous appeals to Vienna, the authorities forbade them to settle in all of Lemberg for almost a century. The only way the city's Jews could escape the discrimination was to culturally assimilate into the Christian majority, and to embrace the ideals of Europeanization, Enlightenment, and modernization. The Austrian authorities approved of this development, but they tried their best to make sure that the Jews wouldn't assimilate into Polish or Ukrainian culture, but into the Austro-German way of life. This was to be achieved with special schools for Jews, in which they would learn German. The man who was tasked with founding and running these schools was Naftali Herz-Homberg, an acculturated Jew and a leading educator. During his studies in Germany and his years as a private teacher of Moses Mendelssohn's eldest son, he had been heavily influenced by the ideals of the Haskalah. The Haskalah, also referred to as the Jewish Enlightenment, was a movement which originated in Germany and sought to educate the Jewish population in the ways of European science, literature, and art. Homberg arrived in Lemberg in 1787, and his enthusiasm for the cause was quickly crushed by the city's Orthodox Jews. who opposed the opening of German schools. He had to rent a room in the Catholic part of town, as no Jew was willing to house him. His secular school was so poorly attended and the cause of so many protests that Homberg left Lemberg just a few years after arriving, and his school was closed in 1806. Still, his efforts weren't in vain, and many young Jews began to learn German themselves in order to get closer to European culture and to hopefully be emancipated one day. After the closure of the German schools, the authorities allowed the Jewish communities to open their own schools, if they wished to do so. While the Jews in other Galician cities, such as Tarnopol and Brode, were quick to open up these schools, those in Lemberg hesitated. But that doesn't mean that the acculturation stopped there. Many young Jews visited ordinary German language schools and universities, and then became doctors, lawyers, and intellectuals. The supporters of the Haskalah began to organize themselves in the 1830s, and in 1846 a reformed synagogue was built in Lemberg. It was called the German Israelite House of Prayer, and German was the language spoken during worship. Still, the majority of the Jews disliked this new development, stuck to speaking Yiddish, and visited the Orthodox synagogues instead. For the longest part, the Austrians managed to keep the various nationalities in Lemberg at bay by granting them small concessions. This endeavour was so successful, in fact, that the separatist sentiment in the Polish November uprising of 1830 against Russian rule didn't swap over to Galicia. Still, many insurrectionists emigrated to Lemberg after the uprising had been crushed and began to politicize the local Polish population. The paranoid and overly cautious police apparatus of Lemberg reacted swiftly, and until the 1840s around 460 potential conspirators were imprisoned. Even during the Galician uprising headed by Polish nationalists in 1846, Lemberg remained remarkably quiet. Because of this, the Austrians were completely taken by surprise when the city decided to revolt just 2 years later. In March of 1848, mere days after the revolution had broken out in Vienna, the citizens of Lemberg demanded communal self-rule and more political participation. After the news of Klemens von Metternich's resignation reached Lemberg, the Polish Democrats Florian Ziemiałkowski, Franciszek Smolka and Tomasz Kulczycki drew up a petition to the emperor, which was then signed by 12,000 people. A crowd of people made up of all of Lemberg's ethnic communities marched to the governor's palace to present the petition and to make their demands heard. The governor, Franz, promised to forward the petition to Vienna, to free all of the political prisoners and to accept the founding of a national guard. Like elsewhere in Europe, the people of Lemberg celebrated together in the streets and demanded freedom from autocracy and political rights for the common man. At this point in time, the Polish elite didn't fight against the German oppressors, but against the conservative state apparatus created by Metternich and the cumbersome bureaucrats. The petition was indeed sent to Vienna, but the government didn't react to it. In their eyes, the constitution created by the liberal interior minister, Franz von Pillersdorf, which turned Austria into a constitutional monarchy with widespread rights for its population, was sufficient enough. Franz was also unwilling to give in to the demands of the demonstrators, but he approved of a Galician delegation to Vienna. Dissatisfied with the progress, the Democrats around Smolka created their own national council to represent them politically. In response, the Ukrainians founded their own parliamentary body, the Ruthenian Supreme Council. While the Poles demanded more regional autonomy and demanded that Poles should play a dominating role in Galician politics, the situation was very different for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians themselves were incredibly grateful for the new constitution and praised the emperor for his goodwill. Even more important than the constitution was the complete abolition of the hated compulsory labor the peasants had to perform for their landowners. The peasants, most of whom were Ukrainians, were now completely free. In a letter to the Ruthenian Supreme Council in Lemberg, the Ruthenian Council of Karłusz expressed their gratitude. All subjects living in the Karłusz deanery expressed their most heartfelt praise to His Royal and Benevolent Highness, Emperor Ferdinand I, for his grace in freeing us from servitude and in raising us to the level of equality with other citizens of the land, for which we promise our loyalty and support to his enlightened throne. Not all was perfect, however. When it was announced that the liberated serfs had to pay compensation to their former landlords, many Ukrainians were outraged. But even then, the blame wasn't put on the emperor or on the Austrian people, but rather on reactionary policymakers in the government or greedy Polish landowners. The reasons for this strong sense of loyalty to the Habsburg Empire are manifold. For one, the monarchy was seen as the only authority that was willing and capable of curbing Polish ambitions to turn Galicia into an autonomous province, in which Ukrainians would only play a minor role. The other reasons are of cultural nature. Ukrainians in Galicia mostly came from a patriarchal structure, with a clearly defined social hierarchy. The emperor, appointed by none other than God himself, was the loving and caring father who could do no wrong. Furthermore, the Austrians fully supported the growth of a distinct Ukrainian national identity, as the Ukrainian majority in eastern Galicia could shield the crownland from Russian or Polish irredentism. The revolutionaries were able to hold Lemberg for a remarkably long time, but the reaction quickly fought back. After the revolutionaries had boycotted the Galician Regional Council, which they thought wouldn't represent their interests properly enough, Franz forcibly dissolved the Polish National Council. Inspired by the events in Vienna in October, where an uprising by the factory workers and rebellious troops forced Emperor Ferdinand I and almost the entire government to flee the city, the citizens of Lemberg also took up arms and occupied the market square and other parts of the city centre. The uprising of Lemberg was very short-lived, however. On the 2nd of November, General William Friedrich von Hammerstein ordered the bombardment of the city to regain control. In the end, 78 people were killed, and the old theatre, as well as the university library, the tower of the town hall, and many parts of the city, were in ruins. The city needed to be rebuilt, and once again the administrators of Lemberg got to work on their Vienna of the East project. To show their commitment to the humanitarian cause, several hospitals were built as well as a house of the invalids. The boulevards around the city were expanded, green spaces were built, houses were richly ornamented, and the matter of dirty and unsanitary streets became a priority. However, they weren't very successful in their endeavour. In 1854, the municipality hung up a note in German and Polish, which clearly shows that the city wasn't managed all too well. It has been noticed with regret that in this city, diverse actions, punishable both through the penal code and police regulations, still take place, such as that public roads are blocked with carriages, cases, barrels and wood, and thus free transportation is also blocked, that diverse substances are being thrown out of windows, that flammable materials are stored in non-fireproof places, that houses, passageways and street routes are not maintained in a clean manner, and that draft cattle are being fed on the street. And so on and so forth. This list actually goes on forever. While the Austrian authorities might have put a lot of effort into making some parts of Lemberg look beautiful and modern, they completely failed to create an orderly and wealthy town. This failure was mostly down to a lack of funding, an unwise spending of said money, and a careless attitude of the population. After almost 100 years under Austrian rule, Lemberg was still one of the poorest cities in the Habsburg Empire, and many people, especially in the Jewish districts, suffered from extreme poverty. And despite the fact that the dirtiness and poverty in the ghetto was a direct cause of the crowded living conditions, the Austrian authorities still stubbornly refused to enlarge the areas Jews were allowed to reside in. Politically speaking, Lemberg lost all of the autonomy it had tried to achieve in 1848. It was re-established as a simple administrative centre within a neo-absolutist framework. The Polish elites of Lemberg were once again politically relegated to merely advisory function, and a freedom of self-governing was denied to them. This all changed after the catastrophic military defeat in the Second Italian War of Independence. Slowly, the Habsburg Empire moved away from its neo-absolutist system and made its first steps towards becoming a constitutional monarchy. In 1862, the new Interior Minister Agenor Gołuchowski enacted the Reichsgemeindegesetz, a law which sought to reduce the administration within the cities and thus save on needless expenses. As part of the law, so-called statutory cities received a special legal status and a special position within the crownlands. Consequently, Lemberg received a much greater degree of autonomy, but was now also obliged to finance itself. In regards to city planning, culture and education, the city was largely free to do whatever it wished. It could also choose its own administrative language. The city councils were elected with the so-called Curia system, which gave wealthy voters a much bigger say and granted them much more representation and power than they were due. This new law mostly benefited the wealthy Polish elite, who quickly seized the opportunity to take over the city council as a political governing body. The Poles had achieved their goal of gaining political autonomy, and what is more, they completely dominated over all the other nationalities. In 1867, the Polish elites would become even more powerful. After another catastrophic military defeat, this time against Prussia, the Austrian Empire was transformed into a dual monarchy in which the Hungarian part of the empire enjoyed complete internal independence from Vienna. The Crownland of Galicia also received further autonomy. The Regional Council of Galicia was now also elected by the governing body with the curious system. Once again, it was Galicia's Polish population that profited the most, and they quickly became the determining authority in Galicia. From now on, the governors, land marshals, and district governors were almost always of Polish ethnicity. For the government in Vienna, this was an advantageous arrangement as it could rely on the near unconditional loyalty from the grateful Poles. With that, the period of a German-dominated and Germanized Lemberg came to an end. It was the dawn of a new era, one in which the city once again received a Polish face and soon became one of the most important centers of Polish culture until the First World War. But that's a chapter that we're going to cover in the next episode. Hopefully, I'll see you then. Alright, dankeschön for watching the video. Hopefully you've liked my little summary of Lemberg's history in the Austrian Empire, which is a video that I've been wanting to make for such a long time, honestly. Do let me know what you think of it, and if you want to see more videos about this fascinating city. Also, please consider subscribing if you haven't already, and leaving a like while you're at it. As always, a special and massive thank you goes out to my invaluable supporters on Ko-Fi. A Cup of Tea, Tristan Kriegsmann, Ryan Layton, Philipp Marchewka, Marius Gerling, the Grand Duke of Sealand, Luca Drohle, Wienweh, Süderreiser, Lyle Furphy, Yin, William, and Big Dave. You are just phenomenal. Have a very wonderful day, and see you next time.